Good morning, YouTube. Once again, it's Kennard Vernon Stewart here for the podcast. We're talking Auburn football. Go ahead and like the video, comment, and subscribe to the channel. As always, it's great to be an Auburn Tiger. We're going to talk real quick about, spring football did not happen, obviously, and for obvious reasons. But there are some position groups that I think, well, I'll say this. I'm not going to say whether they suffered or not, but I'll just say there's some position groups that I would have liked to have seen their development during spring. Stay tuned. So two of the main position groups that I'm referring to is the offensive line and the running backs. Now, the reason why I think the offensive line kind of sort of took a step back, obviously, is because, one, none of the starters really are coming back. All seniors, none of them are coming back. Then you bring on the fact that you have Jack Bicknell as the new offensive line coach. Now he's having to piece together based on what he knows, what he doesn't know, what he has, what he may not have talent-wise. And the spring football would have given a great opportunity for the offensive line to at least have a pretty decent idea as to what the depth chart is going to look like during the fall. But since spring football didn't happen, you got your virtual learning, you got your distance stuff that they got going on. How that stuff works, I don't know, because you can't factor in the physicality. You can't factor in how a player responds to certain levels of adversity. This guy might be good at playing guard. The other guy might be good at tackle. Let's try them at different. But you just can't get a feel for what a player can do until you put them in that level of action. And I think this was a very critical spring football for the offense. Spring. It would have been a big spring football training for the offensive line because you're trying to piece this thing together, and you just can't piece it together if you can't get tangible looks at what these guys can do. Now, the problem with this is, let's just assume that at the earliest, the NCAA health officials decide, okay, it's okay for these players to get back to action, contact action. June 15th. Okay, we got June 15th. On into July. That's like a whole month, another month. It just gives you a very, very small window of time to not only get those reps, but also that evaluation. Because if you think about it, when you have film to study from practices, from the actual spring football game, different scenarios based on different personnel, because when you talk about an offensive line, you're talking about chemistry. And that's something that the offensive line from last year just absolutely did not have. Just didn't have the chemistry. I think as individuals, these players are not all that bad. But when it comes to whether it was development, whether it was chemistry, they didn't seem to communicate very well together. They didn't have a lot of downhill movement when it came to the running game. Not a lot of push, not a lot of leg work. So just didn't have that team camaraderie that I felt that you got to have to have an effective offensive line. Because if any position group has to work together almost like an orchestra, almost in rhythm, in unison, and has to know each other's abilities, has to know check downs, has to know all of those different things that an offensive line unit has to have, that's something that an offensive line, they just got to have it. They got to have that chemistry, and if they don't, it's going to be a complete disaster. And that's what you saw in spots for Auburn last year. Very disastrous play, I thought, on the offensive line at times. So I think the spring would have given these guys a really good opportunity to piece together some type of orchestrated camaraderie and rhythm going into this particular football season. The next position group that I thought really could have benefited from this, and this is more so selfish on my part because I wanted to see this. I wanted to see how the running backs were going to do. I really wanted to see how well Tank Bigsby, for example, he was an early enrollee. So when you're an early enrollee, that gives you the opportunity to get kind of a competitive edge, kind of a head start on everyone else and find your way within the depth chart. Is he big enough? Was he going to have the physicality to automatically transfer from high school to the Power 5 level? Those are some questions that could have been answered in spring training. But because the spring training didn't happen, we won't get to see it. And there's a good chance that because of spring training not happening, that Tank Bigsby might even redshirt. You know, you may have to roll with DJ Williams, Sean Shivers, and then another guy in question, Mark Anthony Richards. How well would he have responded from the leg injury? So those are all things that, to be considered when you talk about how spring training affected these two position groups and what can they look forward to, let's say, given a very abbreviated window of time going into this football season. All right, guys. Once again, it's Kennard Vernon Stewart here for the podcast, talking Auburn football, just talking a little bit about the offensive line and the running backs. Like the video, comment, and subscribe to the channel. As always, it's great to be an Auburn Tiger, War Eagle.